December 23, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in heavy silence. Wind howled through the pines, carrying the faint echo of distant artillery. Dull, rhythmic, relentless. Inside a dimly lit command post dug into a frozen hillside, a German officer leaned over a field map spread beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp. His gloved finger traced the front line, the bold black arcs showing. German spearheads pushing westward toward the Meuse. Around him, the air smelled of damp wool, tobacco, and diesel. A fire crackled weakly in an iron stove. Outside, engines coughed in the cold as exhausted soldiers trudged through knee-deep snow. The officer smiled faintly. The Americans, he believed, were breaking. Reports from the front confirmed heavy Allied retreat. The offensive, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, was working. But then a junior signals officer burst in, breath clouding the air, face pale beneath his helmet. He handed over a decoded message. The officer's eyes narrowed as he read. His hand froze above the map. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were already behind him. The last gamble. Winter 1944 by December 1944. Nazi Germany was cornered. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Red Army's advance, while in the West, Allied forces had broken through France after the Normandy landings and were pushing steadily toward the German border. Towns like Aachen and Metz had already fallen. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was visibly crumbling, yet inside the Führer's headquarters in the Eifel Mountains, a desperate plan had taken form, one that promised to change the course of the war. It was called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Its goal to smash through the thinly held Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and split the British and American armies. If successful, it would trap entire Allied armies in Belgium, forcing them into a negotiated peace. The plan was audacious and suicidal. But Hitler believed boldness could succeed where logic could not. The chosen terrain, the Ardennes, had been the scene of Germany's triumph in 1940. Dense forests, narrow roads, and rolling hills offered concealment. The Allies, assuming it impassable for a major winter offensive, had left it thinly defended. Most frontline units there were green American divisions, weary, inexperienced, or refitting. By early December, German preparations were underway in secrecy. Under the canopy of pine and snow, thousands of tanks and half-tracks were hidden from Allied reconnaissance. More than 200,000 German soldiers gathered quietly, from the seasoned veterans of the 6th Panzer Army to young conscripts of the Volksgrenadier divisions. Their orders: break through the American lines, drive to Antwerp, and sever the Allied lifeline. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes exploded. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces thundered across an 80-mile front. American outposts vanished under sheets of fire. Panzer divisions roared westward through the fog. It was Blitzkrieg reborn, fast, brutal, and unexpected. The German advance stunned the Allies. Entire American regiments were overrun in hours. Communications broke down. Snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft. The roads clogged with retreating convoys. Villages like St. Vith and Clairvaux became desperate strongpoints surrounded by German armor. In the chaos, maps lost meaning. Front lines shifted by the hour. German commanders believed they were driving deep into enemy territory, but they couldn't see the growing danger behind their own flanks. For now, however, optimism still reigned. In command posts across the Ardennes, officers like our protagonist studied their maps and smiled. The push toward the Meuse seemed unstoppable. The fog of war had concealed the truth, that the offensive was running on borrowed time, fuel, and illusion, because somewhere beyond that fog, U.S. forces were already regrouping and quietly preparing a counterstroke that would turn every German map upside down. The fog and the forest, the Ardennes in December 1944 was a place of cruel beauty. Snow-shrouded ridges, dark pine forests, and frozen rivers that wound like veins through the hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. To those who fought there, it felt like the edge of the world. Visibility was low, roads treacherous, and temperatures dropped below freezing each night. The terrain shaped the battle, and ultimately, Germany's failure. The offensive relied on speed and surprise, but the same forest that offered concealment also trapped the German columns. Roads could support only single-file traffic, and once a tank broke down, entire divisions stalled behind it. Fuel was running short even before the first shot was fired. Still, in the early days, the illusion of success held firm. On the German side, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and SS General Sepp Dietrich commanded elite panzer armies. Hitler himself micromanaged from afar, demanding every detail be reported to his Wolf's Lair headquarters. But while he dreamed of reaching Antwerp, his generals understood the limits of their resources. Most units were understrength, ammunition stocks thin, and the Luftwaffe practically non-existent. Across the lines, Allied intelligence had been caught off guard. Reports of German buildup in the Ardennes were dismissed as defensive measures. Many American soldiers had expected a quiet winter. They were wrong. The surprise attack shattered complacency. By December 18th, the U.S. 106th Infantry Division was nearly annihilated at the Schnee-Eifel. 2 of its regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender, the largest American mass surrender in Europe. To the north, Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by the ruthless SS commander Joachim Peiper, surged ahead, leaving a trail of destruction and massacres behind. Yet even amid this chaos, something crucial began to shift. The German spearheads, overextended, undersupplied, and increasingly confused, began to lose momentum. American engineers blew bridges, ambushed convoys, and blocked key roads. Every mile gained cost fuel, time, and blood. By the 5th day, many German maps no longer reflected reality. Commanders, relying on outdated reports, believed their units were miles ahead of where they truly were. Radio contact was intermittent. The snow distorted signals, and Allied jamming added confusion. Convoys went missing. Reinforcements never arrived. Meanwhile, the Allies regrouped with astonishing speed. Under the unified command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reinforcements from Patton's Third Army began to pivot north. In the fog of war, the Germans thought they were still pushing west, but Patton's armor was already on the move, carving through their southern flank. By December 22nd, American counterattacks were closing in from unexpected directions. The German advance was faltering. But deep in his field bunker near St. Vith, one officer, confident, isolated, trusting his map, still believed his division was advancing successfully. He could not yet know that the Allied lines he saw drawn on paper were ghosts. The real Americans were moving quietly behind his position, ready to cut off his retreat. And soon, his map, once a symbol of control, would become a symbol of betrayal. The human angle, the officer and the winter of illusion inside the makeshift command post near St. Vith. The German officer's world was reduced to paper, thin lines of ink that decided life and death. His rank insignia was dull with frost, his face hollow from weeks without proper sleep. Around him, young radio men hunched over crackling sets, their gloved fingers trembling from the cold. The once efficient machine of the Wehrmacht was now a patchwork of exhaustion and misplaced faith. Every morning began the same way. Reports came in handwritten or half-decoded from frontline companies. Positions gained, bridges taken, roads secured. They painted a picture of steady progress, but the officer didn't see the confusion behind them. He didn't see that half the coordinates were wrong, that units were reporting from memory, not location. In the labyrinth of forest roads, even division headquarters were losing track of their own battalions. Still, morale depended on illusion. The men had to believe. They had to trust the lines on the map. He was not alone in that delusion. Across the Ardennes, officers clung to reports that confirmed their expectations. The German propaganda machine broadcast promises of another 1940, of the enemy crumbling before German might. They compared the Ardennes to Sedan, and the Führer's confidence infected the ranks. But this was not 1940. The men were older, the tanks fewer, the skies no longer theirs. The German army that had once raced across Europe was now starved of fuel, ammunition, and hope. Soldiers ate frozen rations and prayed beside burned-out vehicles. As the officer studied his map, he couldn't see the human cost behind the colored lines. He couldn't see the frozen bodies on the forest roads or the civilian refugees trudging through the snow. To him, the war was geometry. Arrows, fronts, bridges, and coordinates. Only when a runner stumbled in from the field, uniform torn, face pale, did the illusion begin to tremble. The man spoke of American tanks seen to the south, of artillery from unexpected directions. The officer dismissed it as confusion. He had seen the map. The Americans were supposed to be miles away. But even as he reassured his staff, his hand drifted to the edge of the table, feeling the tremor of distant gunfire. It wasn't coming from the west, it was coming from behind them. The morale angle, the weight of belief in late 1944, German morale was a paradox. Outwardly fierce, inwardly fractured. The soldiers still saluted with precision, still sang the old marching songs, but deep down most knew the war was lost. Yet the Ardennes offensive rekindled a spark of hope. Soldiers called it die letzte Karte, the last card. If they could strike one more blow, if they could divide the Allies, perhaps there was still a chance to negotiate peace. This hope gave them strength. In the snow and mud, they fought with grim determination. Young Volksgrenadiers, some barely 18, faced seasoned American units with little more than rifles and faith. Their officers, caught between belief and reality, drove them forward. For many, the offensive wasn't just about victory. It was about meaning, a final act of defiance before the inevitable collapse. Even the officer at his map in his quiet bunker was driven by that need to believe the lines still meant something. He didn't yet understand that the lines were already dissolving. The fog outside thickened. The forest grew silent except for the faint echo of tank engines, not his own. And soon, the sound would tell him the truth his map could not. The tactical angle. When maps lied, the Ardennes offensive was built on deception, but not the kind the Germans intended. What began as a meticulously plotted thrust through the forest soon devolved into a labyrinth of miscommunication and lost bearings. On paper, the plan was bold and geometric. 3 panzer armies advancing in parallel, converging toward the Meuse River. Each column had designated roads, objectives, and timetables. But the terrain, narrow, winding, and frozen, turned theory into chaos. Convoys jammed for miles. Fuel trucks froze. Bridges collapsed under the weight of panthers and tigers. Radios faltered in the dense forest, forcing reliance on couriers who vanished or were captured. By the 5th day, entire regiments were operating blind. The officer at his map believed his division was pushing west toward the Meuse. In reality, they were drifting north, away from their supply lines. His right flank, and supposedly secured, had already been pierced by an American counterattack. His fuel reserves were nearly empty, yet every report he received reinforced the illusion of progress. Units exaggerated gains to avoid punishment. Subordinates reported what superiors wanted to hear. The German military machine, once famed for its precision, was now devouring itself in misinformation. Meanwhile, American field commanders adapted swiftly. At the tactical level, they abandoned rigid defense and embraced fluid countermaneuvers. General Eisenhower gave local commanders freedom to react instantly. Major General Matthew Ridgway and others organized mobile blocking forces, while General Patton, operating far to the south, performed the unthinkable, turning his entire Third Army 90 degrees north within 48 hours. As German officers smiled at maps that lied, American maps were being redrawn, in real time by men who were no longer reacting, but hunting. The technological angle, the sound of engines and the weight of steel in the frozen hills, technology decided fate as much as courage. The Germans had superior tanks, the Panther and the Tiger Wonder, masterpieces of engineering that could outgun anything the Allies fielded. But power came with a price. These steel beasts consumed vast amounts of fuel, and in the winter of 1944, fuel was as rare as victory. Each mile forward meant another liter burned. Commanders rationed every drop. Some crews were ordered to abandon tanks once their fuel ran dry, and fight as infantry. The officer knew this but still marked ambitious routes on his map, unaware that many of the vehicles meant to secure those lines were already stranded in the snow. The Americans, by contrast, fought with what they had: lighter, less glamorous Shermans and Stuarts, but they had them in overwhelming numbers. They had gasoline, spare parts, and when the weather cleared, total control of the sky. By December 23rd, the storm began to lift. For the first time in days, Allied aircraft returned to the sky. Thunderbolts and typhoons swooped over the white landscape, striking columns trapped on forest roads. What had once been a hidden army was now a moving target. The officer in his bunker heard the sound of bombs in the distance and assumed they were hitting the Americans. He didn't yet know they were his own supply lines being obliterated. Technology had turned against him. The same radios that once coordinated blitzkrieg now betrayed German positions through intercepted transmissions. The same tanks that symbolized invincibility had become steel coffins in the snow. And above it all, the roar of American engines grew louder, not ahead, but behind, the strategic angle, the blind faith of command in Berlin, Hitler still believed. From his underground bunker he issued daily orders demanding the offensive continue, demanding his armies reach Antwerp. His generals, terrified of contradicting him, obeyed. Field commanders knew the truth. Fuel gone, men exhausted, weather shifting, but they followed orders written in delusion. The officer in the Ardennes mirrored this same blindness on a smaller scale. He trusted the paper more than the sound of artillery. When a messenger arrived reporting U.S. tanks south of their position, he traced a finger over his map and laughed. "Impossible," he said. "They cannot be there." But they were. By the time he realized it, the roads behind him were already blocked. His headquarters, once a point of coordination, had become a trap. The map that gave him comfort now showed only lies. And in that silence between denial and realization, the tide of war turned completely, the moment the map. Died December 23, 1944, near St. Vith, the heart of the Ardennes. The snowstorm that had cloaked the battlefield for a week finally began to clear. The silence of the forest gave way to a dull, mechanical hum, the sound of movement, of engines, of something vast shifting in the mist. Inside a small command post dug into a hillside, the German officer bent over his map again. Thin sunlight filtered through cracks in the wooden roof, falling across the paper terrain. Blue rivers, red arrows, black unit markers. The front line still appeared intact. According to his reports, his division was advancing steadily toward the Meuse, supported on both flanks. Then came the first explosion. It was distant, almost insignificant. A low thud that rattled the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. Then another, closer this time. A radio man shouted over the static, trying to raise a forward battalion. No response. He tried again. Nothing. Moments later, a runner burst through the entrance, breath clouding in the frigid air. His voice trembled as he delivered the message. American tanks, Shermans, had been sighted to the south. Behind their line, the officer's hand froze above the map. "Behind?" he repeated as though the word were foreign. He leaned over, tracing the southern edge of the front. It was impossible. The Americans were supposed to be retreating west, not attacking from the rear. His eyes darted over the grid squares, searching for logic. But the lines no longer made sense. Outside, the hum grew louder, the unmistakable churn of tank treads grinding through snow and ice. The officer stepped outside. The forest shimmered under a pale winter sun. He could see columns of smoke rising beyond the ridge. Thick, black, oily smoke. It wasn't from his artillery. It was from burning supply trucks. He hurried back inside. "Check with headquarters," he barked, but the radio only hissed. Static filled the room. No orders, no updates, no command. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Somewhere beyond the trees, American forces, elements of Patton's Third Army, had looped around the German position, severing the road east. The once bold thrust of Wacht am Rhein had turned into an encirclement. By midday, the truth spread through whispers. The 2nd Panzer Division was stalled. The 116th had lost contact. The roads to the rear were crawling with Allied armor. Every mile of progress had become a trap. The officer looked again at his map. The lines that once gave him confidence now mocked him. His front no longer existed. The entire formation was surrounded, its flanks shredded by forces he didn't even know were there. "Burn it," he ordered quietly. His adjutant hesitated. "Burn it," he repeated, his voice breaking the stillness. As the flames licked the paper, he finally understood. The Germans hadn't been outflanked by numbers alone. They had been defeated by time itself. Their maps showed a world that no longer existed, a static image in a war that was moving faster than anyone could comprehend. The wind howled through the bunker door, carrying the smell of fuel and smoke. Somewhere outside, machine guns opened up, their staccato bursts echoing off the frozen hills. The officer closed his eyes. The sound was coming from both sides now, front and rear. The Americans were everywhere. The collapse of the Ardennes by December 24th. The snow that had once concealed the German advance now betrayed it. Clear skies meant American planes were back. From dawn to dusk, the roar of P-47 thunderbolts filled the valleys. The white forest became a killing ground. Every column of vehicles, every faint plume of exhaust marked a target. What had begun as an ambitious strike westward had turned into a desperate fight for survival. German units that had once advanced confidently through the villages of Bastogne, Saint-Vith and La Roche now found themselves encircled, their supply lines severed, their radios silent. In the bunker, the officer listened to the distant thunder of artillery. His map was gone, burned to ash, but he could still see it in his mind. The neat lines, the perfect arrows. He now realized how fragile they had been, how those lines could never account for weather, fuel, or the will of men. Outside, reality was chaos. The roads were clogged with wrecks, burned trucks, overturned half-tracks, frozen bodies scattered along the ditches. Horses, pressed into service for lack of fuel, stood dead in their harnesses. The snow was blackened by smoke and oil. The Americans were everywhere. To the south, Patton's armored spearheads had broken through to relieve Bastogne. To the north, the 2nd and 9th Armored Divisions tightened the ring. From the west, airborne units, men of the 101st and 82nd Divisions, counterattacked with renewed ferocity. By Christmas Eve, the German salient was collapsing inward like a dying star. In the officer's command post, the atmosphere turned from disbelief to dread. Every few hours, new reports arrived. Enemy armor in Houffalize, artillery spotted near La Roche, bridges lost along the Orth River. The officer stared into the distance, hearing the constant rumble of engines, the sharp cracks of rifles echoing in the trees. At midday, a sergeant burst in. "Herr Hauptmann, the road east is gone." His voice trembled. "American tanks, and they've taken the bridge." The officer didn't answer. He simply nodded. The inevitable had arrived. He stepped outside into the frozen sunlight. In the distance, he could see the horizon flickering orange, fuel depots burning, vehicles abandoned and set alight to prevent capture. The smoke rose in tall, dark pillars, merging with the clouds. He knew what it meant. The offensive, the last great hope of the Reich, had failed. All along the Ardennes, pockets of German troops began to surrender. Others refused, fighting to the last shell, trying to break out east toward the Rhine. But the Allied grip was too strong. In the forest near Mannheim, an American tank commander looked through his binoculars and saw the wreckage of the once feared Waffen-SS columns. Panthers sat motionless, tracks broken, their crews frozen beside them. Snow covered their insignia, erasing identity, erasing the illusion of superiority. For the Germans still inside the shrinking pocket, the night of December 24th was one of silence and resignation. The officer sat near a dying fire, writing in his notebook. He noted the positions of his remaining men, the dwindling ammunition, the names of the dead. His handwriting was steady, deliberate, the last ritual of order in a collapsing world. Then, in the distance, came a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. Bells. Church bells from a village beyond the hills, ringing for Christmas Mass. For a moment, the war felt far away. He looked toward the sound, realizing the bells were coming from behind enemy lines, from territory now held by the Americans. That was when he understood completely. The smile that had once crossed his face over a clean, confident map was gone. The lines, the colors, the promises, all meaningless. The war had outgrown the paper it was drawn on. When dawn came on December 25th, the German officer and his remaining men abandoned the post. They moved east through snow and ruin, avoiding the roads now controlled by American patrols. Some were captured, others vanished in the forest. By New Year's, the German offensive was over. The mighty bulge on the map had flattened, erased, reclaimed by Allied ink. The map had lied. The ground had told the truth. The reckoning in the snow by the first week of January 1945, the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last grand gamble, was dead. The once mighty German bulge that had jutted deep into Belgium was gone, crushed beneath the combined weight of American resilience, Allied air power, and Germany's own exhaustion. What remained across the Ardennes was devastation. Entire towns lay in ruins. Roads that had carried the promise of a German breakthrough were now littered with burned-out tanks, shattered helmets, and the twisted remnants of once proud divisions. Snow covered the dead, Germans, Americans, civilians indiscriminately, blurring the lines between victors and vanquished. In the forest near St. Vith, the officer's former command post was found days later by advancing American troops. The bunker was half collapsed, its stove cold, its papers burned. A few abandoned helmets lay in the mud outside, marked with frost and silence. Inside, the remnants of maps, blackened and curled by flame, clung to the walls. By then, what had once been a confident German offensive had turned into a mass retreat. The Wehrmacht had lost more than 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The 6th Panzer Army, once the pride of the Reich, was shattered. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The Americans suffered heavily too. Over 80,000 casualties were recorded, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest single engagement ever fought by U.S. forces in World War II. But unlike the Germans, the Allies could replace their losses. Their factories were still producing, their supply lines intact, their morale renewed by victory. For Germany, the loss was more than tactical. It was spiritual. The Ardennes had been Hitler's last illusion of control, his final attempt to dictate the shape of the war. When the offensive failed, the myth of invincibility that had sustained the Wehrmacht since 1939 finally disintegrated. In the ruined command post, the officer's fate mirrored that of his nation. Whether he was captured, killed, or simply vanished into the forest, his story ended in the same silence that covered the Ardennes. His map, once a symbol of mastery and precision, had become a relic of hubris. As Allied units pushed east toward the Rhine, they carried with them lessons written not just in orders, but in blood. The Germans had gambled everything on deception, speed, and weather, and lost. The Americans had endured shock, cold, and chaos, and prevailed. In the end, the snow would melt, but the scars beneath it would remain. Burned-out vehicles, grave markers, and shattered churches marked the landscape long after the guns fell silent. And in every village, the people remembered the week when winter turned to fire. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany's defeat was now inevitable, and every soldier left in the Ardennes knew it. The end of illusion in the days that followed the collapse of the Ardennes front. Fragments of the German army streamed eastward, ragged, frostbitten, and broken. The roads through Luxembourg and the Eifel Mountains filled with gray columns of weary men trudging through snow, their once proud divisions reduced to silence and shadows. For many, it was no longer about victory but survival. Trucks and tanks were abandoned where they stood. Engines frozen, fuel gone. Soldiers marched without helmets, rifles slung loosely across their shoulders, boots wrapped in torn blankets. Behind them, the thunder of Allied artillery grew fainter. Not because it stopped, but because they were retreating too fast to hear it. In Berlin, Hitler raged. His dream of splitting the Allied armies had disintegrated in less than a month. He blamed everyone, the weather, his generals, the troops themselves, but never his own delusion. The offensive, he had once said, will decide the war. And in a sense it had. It decided that Germany's end was no longer a matter of if, but when. The failure at the Ardennes destroyed what little reserve strength Germany had left. More than 600 tanks were lost, machines that could never be replaced. Thousands of irreplaceable soldiers were gone. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Even the Luftwaffe, which had briefly surged during the offensive, was spent. When the Soviets launched their final offensive from the east in January 1945, there was no one left to stop them. Meanwhile, the Americans who had survived the battle carried a grim pride. They had endured the coldest European winter in decades and had faced one of the most ferocious counterattacks in modern warfare. From Bastogne to Houffalize, from Elsenborn Ridge to the frozen forest of Clairvaux, they had proven that endurance could defeat surprise. The Battle of the Bulge became a symbol of resilience, not because of perfect planning, but because of courage in chaos. The men who fought there on both sides faced conditions as brutal as any in history: sub-zero cold, hunger, exhaustion, and the omnipresent fear of encirclement. For the German officer whose map had burned in that frozen bunker, the war would end in retreat, captivity, or silence. He was one of countless men who had believed in the lines, the plans, and the certainty of command, only to watch them dissolve in snow and smoke. In January 1945, Allied patrols found his sector abandoned. They entered empty trenches, silent gun pits, and smoldering bunkers. Among the debris, a single corner of a map remained half-charred, with a faint pencil note beside it, coordinates that led nowhere. It was all that remained of an illusion, and one shared by a nation that still believed it could control a war that had long since slipped beyond its grasp. The Ardennes became the graveyard of that belief. It marked the end of German initiative on the Western Front, the final unraveling of Hitler's strategic dream. From that point forward, Germany would only retreat, back through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, and finally into Berlin. And behind every retreating column marched the ghost of that officer, a man who once smiled at his map, certain of victory, until he realized the truth had already surrounded him. The silence after the storm, when the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the snow returned, soft, unbroken, and almost merciful. It covered the craters, the wrecks, and the dead. It hid the evidence of human pride and error. But beneath that calm white surface lay the truth of the last German offensive. That arrogance and desperation had met their end together. The story of the officer who smiled at his map is not just a story of one man. It is the story of an army and a nation that mistook ambition for strength. His confidence, his trust in the clean lines of ink and geometry, reflected a belief that war could still be controlled, that chaos could be commanded. But in the frozen woods of Belgium, that illusion was torn apart by reality, by the unpredictable rhythm of human endurance and the simple fact that the enemy was already behind him. Maps can tell you where you are supposed to be. They can't tell you when you've already lost. In the Ardennes, technology, courage, and strategy collided, but it was adaptability that decided the outcome. The Americans, battered and surprised, learned faster. They moved with the battle. The Germans, still chained to Hitler's fixed vision, did not. And in that difference lay the future of the war. The burned bunker, the frozen forest, the officer's final silence. They all became symbols of a greater truth, that no amount of planning can overcome a world that refuses to stay still. By January 1945, the tide of history had turned permanently. The maps would change again, this time with arrows pointing east toward the heart of Germany. And as those lines advanced, they carried with them the memory of one winter, one failed gamble, and one moment when a smile over a map gave way to the cold understanding of defeat. The war would continue, but the illusion of mastery was gone. The forest had swallowed it, as it swallows all things built on certainty.